Mason Graham, great to see you again. Thanks for being here on New Mexico in Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, I want to get to a lot of different aspects of modernizing the state legislature. It's something we've chatted about quite a few times over the last few years. This year, there's actually been some movement on that. There's a ballot measure that lawmakers passed. It's going to go out to voters in November, asking if they want to pay our state legislators. Can you break down that measure? What exactly is inside it? What would voters be approving if they voted for it?
Well, what we're looking at is paying New Mexico senators and representatives. We're the last state in the country that doesn't pay our legislators any type of compensation. They receive some per diem for the work that they do in Santa Fe. It's around $200 or so. But, that doesn't really cover rooms, doesn't cover, the expenses that you might accumulate when you're leaving your job to go work in the legislature for 30 or 60 days. So what we're looking at is actually trying to bring New Mexico's legislature up to a professional standard. So we have a part-time legislature, as many people know, and all the time in between isn't just empty time. Our legislators do a lot of work throughout the interim and throughout the year to make sure that they're bringing good policies to New Mexico. But with our citizen-led legislature, these are, mostly everyday people who probably work a full-time or a part-time job in addition. But the other reality is that a lot of our legislators fall within one of the 3 R's that we call it, which is retired, rich or wealthy, or extremely resourceful. So there's a big disparity when it comes to the resources that you have in order to run and serve in office, and then the actual capacity that a senator or a representative has to legislate. So what we're trying to do with this is to make sure that across the board, all of our legislators have the ability to bring good policy to New Mexico, to do the work, in that interim period, and making sure they're fairly compensated.
Sure. There have been previous efforts on the books to pay our legislators. I know there was a proposal to create an independent salary commission in the past. That didn't go anywhere. I know other states have done that. We settled on the $68,000 figure that's in the ballot proposal. How did that come about?
So this type of legislation has been brought up in the New Mexico legislature for several decades, actually. It goes as far back as the 1990s. In the late 90s, we actually had this issue on the ballot at one point where it failed. And there's been a number of ways that we've proposed paying legislators or providing them compensation. The Salary Commission is one in recent years that I've actually had the ability to work on. And we've done polling at Common Cause that shows that people want transparency about the amount that legislators make. Since our legislators don't make anything, there's nothing for us to report on as far as the earnings that they receive from their legislative work. But if we are to start to implement a salary or compensation for legislators, maybe an independent commission would be the best way to do that, just to make sure that there isn't any self-dealing. We don't want legislators deciding the amount that they earn.
Right.
So we were able to do the salary commission this time around, although it's been proposed in recent years. What we're looking at now is providing legislators a salary that's equal to the median household income of New Mexico, which is around $68,000. And so that mirrors what they have in the Alabama Constitution, where they also rise and fall their compensation with the state's overall economic growth.
Okay. What's the opposition been over these decades, like you mentioned? Why has it taken so long?
Well, I think when we're talking about paying legislators, a lot of people, have apprehensions when it comes to paying politicians any amount. If we're talking about increasing the salary for the governor's office or increasing the salary for members of the judicial branch and the courts, everybody wants to take a look at that because these are, taxpayer dollars that we're talking about. So that's always going to be a concern. The other concern is, are we creating career politicians? Is this somebody who is going to run for office and serve just because they are going to be promised this paycheck? And I like to push back on that here in New Mexico, that the fact that we don't actually pay our legislators enables more career type politicians to not just run and serve in office, but to stay in office. And I think that's the biggest challenge. You know, we've had legislators who have served over 3 decades in office. They don't have any real challenges in their district, and they are very comfortable in their seat. And since they might be one of those 3 R's that I mentioned before, they have the resources, or they're retired and they have a lot of time, they don't ever have to worry about, you know, those challenges and the competition, and they are very comfortable legislating the way that they know how. But now that we added this additional element of compensation, we could introduce the opportunity for people to say, you know, I want to also run for office, and we want to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to open the lens a little bit and talk about legislative modernization broader than just paying lawmakers. So 2 years ago, the Legislative Council approved full-time aides for lawmakers. How has that helped the work that they do, and in turn the policy that we've seen coming out of the Roundhouse? Have you noticed a difference?
Now, I've gotten an opportunity to work with a lot of the legislative aides, and since they've been implemented. From what I've heard as feedback from the aides themselves and the legislators is that they're very helpful. You know, and I've seen them on both sides of the aisle. You know, when they were initially talking about implementing legislative aides, a lot of people feared that it would be a barrier to kind of the easygoing nature of our legislature, and like you can email or call your legislator, you know that you're going to get that person, you're going to get your senator, you're going to get your representative. Sure. So people were worried about that additional step. But what I've actually seen is that the legislative aides have been able to be effective with communications with constituents, you know, policy research. You know, they show up to some of the meetings that maybe the legislator can't be present on, which is also a part of, you know, why we need to pay our legislators, because they're, you know, have other responsibilities outside of just the work that they do as a legislator. But the legislative aides have been able to step up in some ways, and that has definitely helped with the capacity.
Sure. Has it changed at all the influence of lobbyists on specific legislation? I know in some cases lobbyists work on bills, help write them in some cases. Has that changed at all? Can we expect more of a shift if we were to modernize a bit more?
I think we definitely want to see a shift in the way that lobbyists engage with legislators. Right now, because our legislature is unpaid, and for a long time they didn't have a paid professional staff person, the influence of groups, of interest groups, of private interests, whatever you call it, lobbyists, is pretty great here in the state. And they work very closely to create the laws, provide the research and the information, because the legislators just simply don't have time. And these are extremely complex issues that we're talking about. You know, we're talking about healthcare, education, climate, all of these things. And when you are working within a 30 or 60-day period and you're getting passed a bill that you might not have, you know, in your area of expertise, that allows for the lobbyists to swoop in and tell you, you know, which way you should vote on the bill. The legislative aides have been a great intermediary between, you know, the lobbyists and the legislators themselves, to allow them to like sift through some of the issues, the talking points, the data, and then provide that to the legislators so they can make their own determination. And then also with the additional piece of compensation, legislators would, you know, if they are able to maybe step back from their job responsibilities, do some of that research themselves, and then bring that good policy forward without just the over heavy-handed influence of lobbyists and special interest groups.
Sure. Now you mentioned time being a factor too, and that's another step further down the road, I think. But there was a proposal to change each legislative session to 45-day sessions, and you mentioned 30 and 60 is what we have now. So really that would just spread the same amount of time over 2 years. And we're seeing more and more get packed into what we have now. Where is the balance for time, and so that lawmakers have enough time to go through these complex bills, like you say?
So there was a report that was done by UNM Bieber, and they polled legislators on the amount of time they spent outside of the legislative session doing like policy work, constituent meetings. Came out to about 20 hours a week. So when we think about the 30 or the 60-day period that legislators are working, it's really not that. There's a lot of work that goes on outside of the roundhouse in their districts and with constituents that they do that goes uncompensated. Now, if we're talking about the allocation of time for legislative work in the roundhouse, we would really want to increase the number of days from this 90-day biennial cycle to maybe 90 days every year. It's 120 days, something more like what Nevada has. Now, I think the biggest determination on time for the New Mexico legislature and what legislators are able to get done actually comes down to the governor's message. The governor has the ability to determine which bills are germane during the even-numbered years, which is also the shortest legislative session.
Right.
And what we would really like to see is that any bill is germane, because, you know, some of these issues are happening right now in these communities, and there are serious issues that need attention, but they can't be brought up until that 60-day cycle where everything goes. And so some of the proposals like the 45-day bill, which restructures the number of days in the biennium, is interesting because on the face it shortens the number of legislative days, but it would also remove the governor's call. So in those two 45-day sessions, anything would go. However, the best way for us to really professionalize our legislature, in addition to these other two modernization tenets, paid staffing and paid legislators, would be to increase the number of legislative days.
Okay. Just a quick note, the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, Bieber, thank you for that. Now, let's move a little bit past modernization. I appreciate all of that. One thing that I know you have your eye on also is a proposal to introduce ranked choice voting to Albuquerque. That's been around for a while too now. It hasn't happened. What's the holdup been there, and what could voters expect if that were to go through? Where does that sit?
So right now, the ranked choice voting ordinance is back in the Albuquerque City Council.
Okay.
We're expecting a vote on that in the first meeting in April. And where that sits right now is kind of in a precarious place, because we continue to hear from the people of Albuquerque and voters that they want an electoral system that better works for them, that allows for better democratic outcomes and representation for our communities and for our city. And the Albuquerque City Council has continued to block it. You know, this is the second time that the ranked choice voting ordinance has come up in recent years. And within recent years that has come up, we've had two runoff elections. Actually, we've had several runoff elections within the last decade. Two of the sitting city councilors who are pushing forward for the ranked choice voting ordinance were in runoff elections themselves. This last runoff election that we had for the mayor's race costed the city about $1.8 million. If you look at the city of Albuquerque's budget, you know, they budget for a runoff election, but it is drastically under what the actual amount they spend is. They budgeted around $700,000 for the runoff election. So in addition to the cost savings, what we want is for people to say, you know, I want to be able to choose the candidate that best reflects my interests without like spoiling my vote. And with a two-candidate system, that's what we get. And then when we're not able to hit that 50% threshold and we go to the runoff, less people show up for that. The numbers aren't as good. And then we might end up with, you know, the person who wins that doesn't truly reflect the entire will of the electorate. So we're really hoping that this time around, the city councilors are looking at what recently happened with the mayor's race, the amount that was spent, and look forward to better democratic solutions, especially for elections, given everything that's going on in the country. We have an opportunity to really set like an amazing precedent here in Albuquerque, and then also catch up with, you know, two other cities in New Mexico, Santa Fe and Las Cruces, right, that are already using ranked choice voting to great success.
Sure. Appreciate that. One more thing I know you guys are watching at Common Cause is voting access. We know the Trump administration is doing everything it can to restrict voters, requiring ID. That hasn't happened yet, but proof of citizenship, these are all proposals that they're pushing in Washington, outlawing mail-in voting. what should we be aware of as New Mexicans in this push from the White House? I know you're working on an election protection program. How's that been going?
So here in New Mexico, we're actually very fortunate because we have the best elections in the country, and that's objective. There was a recent study done by MIT in their elections and democracy department that determined New Mexico is the #1 state for election administration, which is fantastic. And part of that comes down to our voting convenience centers. We have places that people can go and vote on election day in every county. We've got ballot drop boxes in every county. We've recently passed 2 amazing voting rights reforms for tribal lands and indigenous people who can request an absentee ballot without a traditional address that's typical on tribal reservations. And then also we have the back end voter registration system as well, so people can register to vote right there at the MVD. We have same day registration. People can update their registration and vote on the same day. So we have all of these things that are in place that have been passed through the legislature in our state to make sure that New Mexicans have all the access that they need. And now with these new mandates coming down, or proposed mandates coming down from the Trump administration, we see our state in a position where, once again, we're setting a precedent for what we think other states should do. But because we've taken the time to bolster our elections and our democratic process, we're pretty well insulated, I would say. Now, we run a program that puts volunteers outside of polling places, and their entire goal is to make sure that voters know their rights. They are watching for threats of intimidation or voter violence. They're making sure that people have the documentation that they need in order to register same day, because it's not all the same. And then overall, just be encouraging of folks for getting out there and casting a ballot and participating in this amazing process that makes our country our country. And so the election protection program this year is probably more critical than ever, given the threats that there may be, ICE agents at the polls or National Guards we've seen mobilized, and then the overall state of where elections are, given the rhetoric coming from the president. He recently said that mail-in voting is cheating, and then turned around and casted a mail-in ballot himself, right? Here in New Mexico, we have no excuse absentee mail-in voting. Anyone can use a mail-in ballot here, and we definitely encourage that. We have a huge landmass. The majority of people who live in rural areas live several miles from their polling place. And so we're going to be providing the resources to people on the ground. We also have a hotline that people can call if they do have questions about, maybe even their mail-in ballot or where their nearest polling place is or what their rights are, what to expect for the election. And that hotline is 866-R-VOTE, OURVOTE. And we really want people to engage with that. We want people to engage with our people who are outside of the polls if you see them. And we just want to make sure that everybody who is eligible and wants to vote has the ability to.
Okay. Now that program, if some of these proposals go through, if elections become federalized as President Trump has proposed, are programs like that enough? What else would need to be done to protect elections in our state?
Fortunately, the program itself will not be enough. These are volunteers. These are citizens who are very passionate about democracy and elections, who want to make sure that your right to vote, that's sacred, is protected, and the president is trampling all over that. There will need to be some additional measures, definitely. We've heard from our congressional leadership, our senators, and our representatives that they are not going to approve any of those measures that try to claw back some of the voting rights that we already have. I think ensuring that they hold that stance is super important. And then also here at the state level, our legislators, those are the first line of defense for things that are coming down. So when you're speaking with your legislator, whether they're Democrat or Republican, you want to make sure that you're telling them how you feel about how we can keep New Mexico's right to vote protected, how we can stay number one. And because we're very diverse with a lot of diverse backgrounds, people, history, we're a border state. There's a lot of anxiety and tension out there around what this election is going to look like. We're going to do our part to make sure that people are safe and protected, but we're definitely willing to go that extra step if we see anything come down from the Trump administration.
Okay, understood. Mason Graham, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.